one of the things that the Hizmet movement does is to help us to see how you can translate these deeper sources of Islam into the modern world. And he is acquainted with Muslim interpretation and his what I can tell is he tries to talk Well, my name is Pim Valkenberg and I'm teaching at the Catholic University of America. I'm teaching in the field of religion and culture. My specialty is Christian-Muslim relations, and that's also how I got involved in learning about Fethullah Gulen and the Hizmet movement. I think that the Hizmet movement is, as far as I can tell, one of the most important movements that try to bridge between the, generally speaking, the Muslim world and the Turkish world more in specific, and the Western world by being accepting of both cultural environments and trying to build all kinds of bridges. Of course, there are more groups that are doing that, but I think the Hizmet movement is a very active group, and it does a lot of good work. I did never meet Hajj Effendi Fethullah Gulen himself, but I've read quite a bit of his books and heard much more about his idea from some of the people who are following him, and I think that what I can tell is he again tries to talk to the people that want to listen to him, both in the Muslim world and in the Western world, on the basis of a very sound knowledge of the Islamic tradition. On the one hand, I think he has a profound knowledge, as far as I can tell, of course, of the Quran and of the Hadith, and also the tafsir, the interpretation of the Quran. On the other hand, he is also very thoroughly acquainted with the Ottoman Turkish tradition of, on the one hand, the Quran and its interpretation, but on the other hand also the Sufi tradition. And more specifically, of course, he has a very good knowledge of the works of Sayyid Nursi, which I think is kind of a figure that bridges the traditional Muslim interpretation and his personal interpretation. But as I said, it's very grounded in the Muslim tradition through the intervention of people like Sayyid Nursi. One of the things that I do for my work is I teach a lot about interreligious dialogue, and I do a lot of research about interreligious dialogue. And one of the, I would say, misunderstandings that people always have of dialogue is that it would require you to dilute your own faith. So to say, if you are in dialogue with others, you will lose your identity. And it has been my experience, and I think that of many others who are engaged in dialogue, that instead of diluting, it strengthens your own faith, because you are more required to think about what exactly you believe. If I may add an example, one of the things that I remember very well, when I was a young theologian, of course I knew about the Trinity, which is of course for Christians something that they believe in God, Jesus Christ as the Son of God and the Holy Spirit. And obviously that's one of the big points on which Christians and Muslims have a different idea. So I was obliged, when in dialogue with Muslims, of course they asked me, okay, can you explain why this Trinity and why you think that is so important? So I needed to study my own tradition more in order to be able to give a good answer to Muslims. And I think that's a good example of how dialogue does not dilute, but it deepens your own rootedness in your own faith tradition. I think that what is important in the way in which both Fethullah Gulen and the Hizmet tradition engages in this dialogue with others is this exactly this combination of being rooted in their own tradition and working from their own tradition and taking the fruits of their own tradition and trying to open that up to the broader public. One of the ways in which I think you can show how Fethullah Gulen is rooted in his own tradition, but at the same time gives a very specific interpretation of that tradition that helps us in the common world to live together in a better way, is his approach to this famous theme of peace and war. You know, there are all these studies about jihad, what it means and what it not means. And I've done some study of what Fethullah Gulen thinks about that. And one of the things that I noticed was that he says, well, you have to make a distinction between the normal situation and the exception. And he says, well, Muslims living peacefully together with people of other faiths, that is the normal situation. And situations of war, situations of strife, these happen as well. And of course the Quran talks about it, but these are more or less exceptional. So he says peace is the rule between Muslims and people of other faith, more specifically with the people of the book, the Jews and the Christians. He somewhere in his writing says, so if you take that as a kind of a, I would say, hermeneutical key, a key to interpret the Quran, then you can say, well, that means for us, contemporary Muslims, that we have the obligation to live peacefully together with others, and we have to promote everything that contributes to peace among people of religion, and we have to work against everything that works against peace. So I think that is a quite good example of how he interprets his own sources. And of course, Gulen gives more like the spiritual background, and it's the people of the Hizmet movement that work actively to bring about better relationships. So you can say he inspires them. There are, as you know, a lot of discussions about what exactly is the role of Fethullah Gulen in the Hizmet movement. Is he the boss or not, etc., etc. But I think what I've heard from most of the people from the Hizmet movements, that he says, well, he's not a kind of a general organizing his troops. That's sometimes a metaphor that you hear. He's our spiritual inspiration. So he studies the scriptures of Islam, and he gives his sohbats, he gives his talks, and he inspires his followers to act in certain ways. As you know, I teach quite a few classes on Islam, and of course, mainly here in the United States with undergraduate students. Their knowledge of Islam, generally speaking, there are some exceptions, but generally speaking, their knowledge of Islam is pretty shallow, which means that they know only what they hear in the press. Of course, they know 9/11, they know some of the big conflicts that are going on, and of course, they've heard in the media that Islam has a role in that. So that's the way that they come to study the religion of Islam. And one of the things that I want to show them is that Islam is much broader than that, and maybe more importantly, much deeper than that. So I try to bring them to study more the sources of Islam rather than what you hear about in the mass media nowadays. And I think that one of the things that the Hizmet movement does is to help us to see how you can translate these deeper sources of Islam into the modern world. So to come back to something that I said before, when you compare it to most other Muslim groups that you hear much about in the media, I think this is one of the few groups that really combines openness to a dialogue between cultures and religions on the one hand, and a rootedness in their own tradition on the other. And I think that that is a very important combination. And it's also the kind of combination that I think is most fruitful for the future. Because if you are not rooted in your own religious tradition, you will end up losing any nourishment, because the nourishment comes through the roots. So if you lose your roots, you get no nourishment. So you end up being shallow and not really contributing anything. On the other hand, if you're only focusing on your own tradition, you're not opening up to a broader public. And I think it's exactly the combination of the two that is very important. When we are looking at the present day political situation with the AK party ruling for some time, one of the impressions that you get, and once again, must have kind of a disclaimer because I'm not a political scientist, I'm a theologian. So, but what you see is when a party is in power and has kind of an absolute majority for some time, you sometimes see that people's behavior begins to change. And I cannot give you an exact analysis, but I think this is one of the reasons why there is now a growing tension between the political majority party and the Hizmet movement. That is, of course, related to this investigation about corruption. But I think it is a kind of a wider problem that you see nowadays in Turkey about people not being totally sure of what the best way towards the future is going to be. What is the way that would help us to go forward towards the future? And I would suggest that when political power becomes too much of a goal for people, they kind of threaten to become detached from their own roots. And it's again the same metaphor that I used before. When you become detached from your own roots, you do not get the spiritual nourishment that you would need to get. Now, this is not to suggest that people are not religious enough or whatever, but it is to suggest that when the discourse, when the talk is about how to gain political power and how to keep political power, we are quite far away from a situation in which you allow yourself to be nourished by your own religious roots. So I think this is one of the reasons why both in Christianity and Islam there is a tradition that says, well, you should stay away from this political power. And of course, both in Said Nursi and in Fethullah Gulen, that's an important theme as well. And I think you can see in the lives of both Nursi and Gulen some movements going towards more engagement in politics and some movements going away from engagement in politics.
What Gulen is put in his writing is really giving us very strong ideas how different groups, religious groups, ethnic groups can come together and how they can create dialogue.
The Hizmet movement is willing to embrace those in far corners of the world who are willing to serve God, who are willing to experience God, who are willing to submit themselves to the understanding of God's will.